From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights Podcast.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a special live edition of HPS Insights. My name is Brian DeAngelis. I'm a partner here at Hamilton Place Strategies and one of our frequent podcasters, along with my co-host, Matt McDonald, who's joining me today. So we're particularly excited to host our first video episode in front of a live audience. We have two very special guests today joining us from one of HPS's new partners, Ballast Research. We have Mike Gottlieb, President of Ballast Research, and Michael Griffin, Ballast's Director of Research. Mike and Michael are here to discuss the release of their annual Washington Insights Report. But first, I just want to set the stage a little bit and let me cover a few logistical points for those of you in the audience. By way of background, last year, HPS and Ballast Research, along with a third firm, Alva, a stakeholder intelligence platform, joined forces so we could offer our clients a comprehensive solution to stakeholder management. By bringing together Alva's platform with Ballast direct research and insights into policymakers with HPS's data-driven approach to public affairs, we are now able to provide corporate leaders with the solutions they need to manage a increasingly complex set of challenges they face from stakeholders. The findings from this year's Washington Insights Review will provide a lot more context on those challenges and what corporate leaders and policymakers are facing. I'm sure many of you tuning in will have questions for Mike and Michael. So here's how we'll run this. I'm going to turn things over to Mike in a minute here to walk us through the background around this report and the work that Ballast does. I'll then ask Michael Griffin to jump in and talk a little bit about this year's findings in particular. And Matt and I will join in the discussion throughout. What I'll ask all of you watching from home and our virtual audience to do is, if you have a question, please type them into the question and answers tab on your screen. I'll be monitoring that with our team, and we'll try to get as many as we can in the next 30 minutes or so. So with that, Mike, Michael, Matt, thanks for joining me. Mike, let me kick things off by turning it over to you. Can you give us a brief overview of what the Washington Insights Review is and the policymaker research that you all are doing at Ballast that informs this report each year?
Yeah, I'd be delighted. And thank you, Brian and Matt, for including us and for your partnership. So Ballast Research has a pretty focused mission, and that is to improve policy conversations in Washington and states and local jurisdictions. And our hypothesis is that there's an enormous amount of information to be shared between and among social sector, public sector, private sector advocates, but that it is not always the most efficient. And we see a lot of meetings and communication strategies, public affairs, engagements that are not providing specifically to policymakers the kind of data research and analysis that they need to inform their productive policymaking. And so what we do every year is rather simple. We engage policymakers at the local, state, and federal level every year, all year, at the White House, on the Hill, senior staff on the Hill at the agencies, also governor's offices, state legislators, to try to understand from them what they need from the numerable advocates that are engaging them. What kind of one-pagers are useful? What kind of data are you looking for? What do you need from this or that sector to really help drive and improve your public policymaking? And at the end of each year, we compile that research, we digest it, and we try to summarize what we think is most useful in a summary assessment of what policymakers are looking for. And that is the substance behind the report that we're talking about today.
That's great. That's great. Michael Griffin, why don't I ask you now if you can jump in, and can we kick off this discussion with maybe an overview of your findings this year, anything you all want to highlight for the audience?
Sure, happy to. And thanks again, Brian and Matt, for having us today. This year's research really centers on the idea of corporate citizenship and how what it means to be a good corporate citizenship is changing. And of course, our research looks at this primarily through the lens of one key stakeholder audience, government policymakers, and how companies are engaging specifically in DC. The reason why we're looking at it this year, right now, is because COVID has really accelerated the extent to which companies are engaging on a broader set of political and social issues under pressure from customers, employees, other stakeholders as well. So issues like Black Lives Matter, voting rights, climate, just to name a few that have been prominently in the news in the past year and a half or so. For a lot of companies, engaging on these issues is new. For many C-suite leaders, effectively engaging on these broader issues is not something they necessarily all have experience with, not something they've built a skill set around in their careers. And so perhaps unsurprisingly, we see varying levels of effectiveness in terms of how companies tackle these issues. And we certainly heard that this past year in our conversations with policymakers, in the sense that many told us that they see room for improvement in terms of how companies can engage effectively on these issues in Washington. There were certainly notable differences across parties in terms of how they perceived corporate citizenship more generally and company engagement. But what was interesting is that there were a few common themes that cut across both sides of the aisle in terms of what we heard from policymakers in terms of what they think strong corporate citizenship looks like, especially looking forward in a post-pandemic world. Just to summarize some of the key findings in terms of what policymakers want to see, three key areas. The first is they want intentional, not reactionary engagement. So, we heard that policymakers very much welcome engagement on issues, especially those that are central or core to the business, as opposed to what some called or viewed as sort of knee-jerk reactions to the issue of the moment, reacting to the news cycle. Second, we heard that policymakers want to hear and see realistic commitments, as well as organizations are taking responsibility for their impact. We heard a lot of skepticism about unrealistic promises, especially if they're not paired with some short-term accountability for results. And the third thing we heard and found pretty consistent across our research across the past more than 8 years is they want to see the local impact. Policymakers, again, across both sides of the aisle, want to see local impact from advocates. How is this going to impact my constituents, and however that's defined? They appreciate and want to see data. They want to hear compelling narratives about local impact.
Let me ask you a question there, Michael. My gut tells me that last piece has maybe changed a bit over the years. So I'm curious how much the pressures of COVID-19 and this hitting everyone in a very personal way, whether it's through school, through their jobs, through just being stuck at home for those first few months, have led to this kind of new standard of corporate citizenship and led policymakers to want to see more of that local impact.
Sure. Yeah. And, I think when we talk about what's changing, I would say the focus on local impact has been pretty consistent. That's something we hear every year. I think what's really changed perhaps is the types of issues that we're seeing the private sector engage on. And I think if you ask, well, what's underneath that? What's driving that? Especially as it relates to COVID, I think, to be clear, it's not necessarily being driven, obviously, from the policymaker perspective. It's really being driven by customers and by employee expectations. And what we've seen is that expectations of customers and employees during COVID have shifted. And in doing this research, some really interesting data around how a majority of employees now, 54% say that CEOs should speak out on controversial issues, whether it's social or political. Same for consumers. A majority now say that the brands should engage on at least one social issue that's not directly impacting its business. And I think true for general public as well. A vast majority, 80% plus Americans expecting corporate leaders to speak out on social issues. And it's true across Democrats, Republicans, Independents, more than 2/3 saying this. And so, obviously a lot of these trends predated COVID, but I think what we're seeing is that really accelerated during the pandemic. And as a result, companies are feeling more pressure to engage on these broader issues.
Can I ask on that question? It's an interesting scenario where, in theory, like people who disagree on the particulars of an issue both want a CEO to speak out on the issue. Does everyone think that the CEO will agree with them? Is that the underlying assumption of like where this stuff hashes out? Because for the CEOs, it's a question of, okay, everyone wants you to speak out. Like, what do you say? Right.
Yeah. And that's the challenge, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. That's what makes this difficult. And I think what we heard is that, again, variety of approaches in terms of how companies have been weighing in, and also kind of varying levels of effectiveness in terms of how they've been doing it.
It is interesting. It does seem to your earlier point, it does seem to, some of these things feel like they require a black belt in politics, not like a yellow belt. And I feel like a lot of companies are struggling with, that's not, most CEOs weren't promoted to that role through their kind of facility with public political commentary, but it does have a higher stakes vibe to it these days.
Matt, I think we're seeing that on the client side, just as Michael has described. We're seeing policymakers demand, invoke, invite the participation of higher level corporate senior leadership on issues that, you're quite right, they certainly don't have a black belt in, or really any primary interest in. They're trying to run a company, they're trying to focus on their business. And so their response has been, what do I need to manage this? Who do I need in the room? And as we look at the constellation of senior executives who are now participating in enterprise level conversations, we're seeing government affairs and government relations, if they had not been in those conversations previously, more likely to be central to those conversations, or, I'll be very candid, oftentimes excluded, to the great risk of the company. And we've seen a lot of company lessons learned in the last year where GR or external affairs was not included in certain decisions that directly impact that stakeholdership. So it's really interesting to see not only how policymakers are driving the participation of senior leaders, but how those senior leaders are reacting in some rather substantial structural ways in how they manage that stakeholdership.
Mike, can I ask you to expand on that a little bit, thinking about the last year? We saw a number of moments where senior leaders are expected to weigh in on some very political issues, voting rights, others, at the same time where, that may harm them with some of their Republican targets, but at the same time, they're out there advocating for some of the tax reform issues and infrastructure that Biden was pushing. So it strikes me, I think we all see it every day, that a corporate leader can be pulled in two very different directions pretty aggressively. How are you seeing folks manage that, or how do policymakers understand that?
Yeah, so let me back up a little bit. We've been studying, hundreds, if not thousands, of senior policymakers for the last decade. And one of the things that we look at is, in this year, what are your priorities, right? That's what we're trying to convey. Hey, folks, right now it's COVID. So everybody's focused on COVID. If your policy priority is not COVID, you're probably not going to get the meeting. We need to be able to communicate what the main policy priorities are of our public sector colleagues so that they can get the benefit of targeted, tailored information to help them do their work. The other thing that we look at is year over year, tactically, strategically, substantively, what's most impactful to policymakers. And one of the things that comes through year after year across both sides of the aisle is meaningful investment in communities, in stakeholders. So look, when we look at what are the best levers to advocate in Washington or in any jurisdiction, it's your lobbyists, your lobbying team, right? That's your frontline staff. That's your greatest asset. But what distinguishes you most from the 300 other offices in Washington that are also advocating with large lobbying teams and really good, exceptional lobbying strength? It's research and data. It's also investment in communities. And what policymakers on both sides of the aisle are looking for is what Michael alluded to earlier. It's got to be intentional. It's got to be realistic. It's got to be not, too reactive. But what we're looking for is, number one, is it local? Is it relevant to my jurisdiction? If you are funding, a PPE in some other state and really doing great work for that state, but it's not my state, that's great for you, but I don't really care. Is it in my jurisdiction? So is it local? That's always useful. And second, is it somehow authentic to who you are as a business and a policy player in Washington. So for instance, if you are a beverage company, investment in water sustainability gets you more credit, credibility, interest, engagement than investment in, I don't know, cancer research or PPE, right? Because you're a beverage company. If you're a manufacturing company, your management of the supply chain and your support for PPE is actually rather more authentic to who you are. If you are a financial services company, maybe financial literacy in the communities that your policymaker colleagues serve is useful. So this whole idea of corporate social responsibility investment actually has bipartisan strength, attachment, credibility. Where it begins to divide parties is where it becomes either political or purely political, or can be perceived to be purely political. Mm-hmm. And I will caution here, I'm only talking about policymakers, right? So the C-suite and corporate stakeholders have to manage employees and consumers and investors and activists and this burgeoning democracy of stakeholders. Well, I'm only talking about policymakers. So you may be hearing from your employees, listen, Madam President, you've got to opine on this issue because it's important to us as your employees. Policymakers, except for, some signaling, are not giving you credit for engaging or really sticking your head out on those social issues. And they're certainly not doing so in a bipartisan way. So one of the things that we're advising to our clients, based on what policymakers are telling us, is stick to what you know, stick to your strengths. If we are talking about energy transition and you are an oil and gas company, come in with your research, your data, your perspective, your expertise. But it is not necessarily, not to single out an oil and gas company, but it's not clear to us why you would have a particular purchase on voting rights or on police reform or any number of issues on which you may opine, but don't necessarily inure to your credibility as a policy advocate. So that's the needle that we're trying to help folks through it.
Mike, what is the sense among policymakers of how many companies are threading this needle or doing this well versus not doing this well? Is there a view on that?
Yeah, so there's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is no one's doing it really well. The good news is it creates an opportunity to stand out right quick, right? So in this highly saturated environment, in this very partisan, very noisy, and I will say more and more hard, challenging, noisy, partisan environment, it's just going to get worse. The opportunities to stand out are greater than ever before. So when we do study companies who get this right, they can do so in a short amount of time and stand out at least from their sector, if not from cross-sector advocates in Washington. So in answer to your question, it is actually not difficult to get policymakers to name a particular company, less common a particular industry, but a particular company that is getting this right and engaging above the fold, so to speak, with long-term credibility, meaningfully investing in communities. Now, if you get them to name 3 or 4, that's going to be tough. But again, it creates this opportunity. And again, if I may, it's at relatively low cost to the company. Most companies we study are investing heavily in social responsibility, philanthropy, communities. They are either not communicating that to policymakers because it's driven by marketing or corporate comms and they aren't equipped or focused on senior policymakers in Washington, or it's not being communicated to those policymakers in a way that resonates with them, that is relevant to them, that is in the language in any number of the DC publications that will capture their attention and help inform their policymaking, which is great opportunity. There's lots of opportunity here.
One of the, I would say, questions that we get most frequently from clients or potential clients is advice on the decision-making process for this type of situation, being asked to weigh in on this. There's some things that we've worked with them on in terms of ensuring a range of backgrounds and perspectives in the room for that sort of thing, thinking about precedent setting. There's a bunch of other tools that we've kind of worked with clients on. Is there anything top of mind that you guys would either recommend or see in clients to help navigate, I guess, the moment of the decision of, do we need to say something? How do we weigh in? It feels like the things that you're talking about in terms of like setting yourself up for success and authenticity make a lot of sense. And I hear clients agree with that stuff, but then there's the moment when, everything is under scrutiny and under the microscope, which feels like a very different moment for a lot of them.
Look, I have a take on this. It'll sound a bit cheeky, and it is, but you ask what is the decision-making advice? Have one. Have a process of decision-making. That's goal number one, right? So like where we see folks get flat-footed or caught off guard is, what do we do about PAC spend? I don't know. Well, someone's yelling at us to stop spending money on people they don't like. How do we respond to that? I have no idea. As compared with, thank you for the question, here's how we as a company view political spend. These are our first principles. This is our framework. And here is the flow chart that we put a decision through. Like it or don't like it, but that's what it is. That will get you so much, I think leverage, that's the wrong word, but I think that gets you a lot of credibility. So there are two things I would say is, one, develop that. It doesn't have to be perfect, but develop that so you can communicate it and articulate it. And by the way, it's not coincidental. The reason folks don't have this decision-making framework is they haven't thought it through at a senior level. They don't really know, and there are not many of them aren't guided by first principles. So do that work. And I really like your point about having the right folks in the room. I'm a little biased here because we work in the government affairs community, but for goodness sake, have government affairs part of the conversation. Even if he or she is overruled, it may well be that general counsel has an equity or corporate comms has an equity or investor relations has an equity that overrides GR's view on this, but at least be informed by the impact that any decision will have on this particular stakeholdership of policymakers, so that 2 years from now, when we have a challenge in that community, we will understand why it is and how to overcome it. But I think and there are trade associations that do this, I think, particularly well. There are models for a decision-making framework on how to either spend politically or engage on particular social issues, the very fact of which allows senior stakeholders to respond to communities and demonstrate, the process that drives these outcomes.
I want to jump on that. And something you said, Michael, about customers, and we give the same advice to a lot of clients of, let it be authentic, let it be true to you. But we do have a question from the audience about what you guys are seeing. Maybe Michael Griffin, this would be a good one to bring you back in. But what percentage of customers think corporate leaders should be speaking out on issues that don't affect their business?
Yeah, no, and that's a good question, and it's certainly something we looked at right in the research, and I was talking about earlier in terms of what's really driving this. And what we see is a lot of the change is being driven by expectations of customers as well as employees as well, and it was the majority of customers, and see if I can find a specific number, 53% tell us that brands have a responsibility to get involved in at least one social issue that doesn't directly impact their business. But it's not just customers, right? It's also, we see it with employees as well in terms of their expectations on the types of issues that they expect their employers. So that employer-employee relationship has really changed a lot. Again, this is a long-term trend, but accelerated pretty dramatically in the last couple of years, seeing the same thing on the consumer side as well. And I think that's what's driving a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the breadth of the issues that companies are engaging in DC on in the past couple of years.
And Mike Gottlieb, I think you just answered this a minute ago, but the advice we give to clients there that I think you'd agree with is, if you have that demand, right? If you're a corporate leader and your customers are driving you to weigh in on an issue, then have GR in the room and have comms in the room. And so when that can be communicated up to policymakers and those other stakeholders in the appropriate way. But correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, I think that's right. And I think it speaks to a broader strategy or strategic imperative, which is if you're a corporate leader, you now need more people in the room than you had before. And maybe you revise your corporate structure so you have folks who can represent those interests. And we're seeing some corporate restructuring so that message, all GR, comms, investor relations, all ladders up to a representative, but you have more a more diverse set of more powerful stakeholder interests that you must serve as a corporate leader now. Policymakers are among them. And I think what's most useful and what we are trying to provide corporate leaders is some mechanism, some framework, some dashboard, if you will, of where these various interests are driving us and how best to respond to them, both individually and also as a group, and how to make sense of it. The reason corporate leaders are in the place that they are is because of their decision-making ability and their leadership skills. And those decisions will be made based on that purview, but they've got to have the inputs. And where we see corporations get into trouble is by virtue of the fact that the room was, and forgive me, I'm just going to make some up, only GC and, an external comms consultant. Some important stakeholder impacts were perhaps not well articulated, and the decision may have come out the same way, but there was less ability to plan for those stakeholder responses. So yes, I think it's a bigger tent, perhaps more cooks in the kitchen. That's going to create challenges as well, but it is reflective of this stronger, more diverse, perhaps more democratized set of stakeholder interests driving corporate decision making.
It's a good point I like the point on, the decision may not change, but you can make the decision more robust, right? A lot of the times you get into situations where you'll have a better sense of what the trade-offs are. If you think there's not a trade-off, you might be missing something. You can get into situations where, okay, there are a series of follow-on consequences or other statements that we're going to have to make in the future, and contemplating those and having just a little bit more look around the corner. Those are the types of things that a robust decision-making process will yield, as opposed to kind of I'm getting a lot of pressure and, so-and-so sent me this article that they saw. I mean, that's those are not the place where you want to land for a real robust, durable decision-making process on this type of stuff.
It also speaks a little bit to where decisions historically have been centered or made in certain corporate structures and how that is changing. I think you all know better than I the evolution of corporate communications, of marketing, of Marcom as an industry. I think we're now seeing an evolution of government affairs, external affairs, and the role and complexity of the division that is served by the company, given the policy environment that we're operating in.
I've got one last question in here, and then maybe I'll close with you, Michael Griffin. But are you all finding any issue areas for which policymakers think corporate engagement is not appropriate? A sort of stay out of this one for us.
I mean, that's, I think, an interesting question. It's one we actually posed in a lot of our conversations with policymakers. And I think what we heard most frequently was no, there aren't specific issues that are off limits. And in fact, a number of folks were quick to note, look, these companies, these leaders have a right to engage and speak out on any of these issues. But what we did hear was more about how are they engaging? And that was sort of the feedback. Is it intentional? Is it credible? Is it authentic? And that's sort of more of where we heard kind of the opportunity for improvement, but also to the good in terms of where things were working well, in terms of where they saw positive engagement. One area, just to give an example to flesh that out a little bit more, that we highlight in the report is around environmental responsibility, which is increasing in importance as we think about what does corporate responsibility mean? What are some of the issues? And obviously, it's going to vary by company and by industry, but in general, we see that's an increasingly important issue. And certainly in our polling of policymakers, they tell us across the board that's increasingly important in terms of how they think about environmental responsibility is increasingly important to them in terms of how they think about the private sector and corporate citizenship. And just one example to come out of that, when we asked, who's doing a good job on this, we heard lots of different answers, as you might expect. But one sector that we heard a lot of positive feedback on was the utility sector, on utilities in particular. And so when we talk about intentional engagement, what we heard from some policymakers is this sector, and it was very intentional in terms of reaching out very proactively and consistently to help us understand their interests, in particular around how will different policy paths or options impact costs for ratepayers, for example. Being forward-looking, so thinking about what are the investments that are required in infrastructure, for example. And then jobs, people pointing to specific numbers of jobs, specific regions related to investments that were made in the renewable space. So just to kind of give an example in one specific issue area that kind of came up organically in our conversations.
And Brian, some of this, reality intervenes. Just as an empirical matter, there are issues on which CEOs did not previously opine, and without naming names, all of a sudden now there's 5 CEOs who've entered into that fray, and so you can no longer say, well, CEOs don't do that. And so, a lot of that ship has sailed. And I think, as Michael has said, a lot of the question is how do you engage? But it's easy to open the floodgates, especially in today's environment where you have a changing model of corporate leadership, much of which is more independent than it had been before, coming from certain sectors more than others. But I think what we've seen in the last 5 years in particular is CEOs engaging on topics where now it becomes table stakes or expected by policymakers.
Yeah, and we've seen it on our side where there becomes a big risk to be the last to say something or the one who hasn't said something. So I'm completely with you. It's the how you do it, not necessarily the when. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and so maybe we'll wrap up here. Michael Griffin, I think a lot of folks find this data and these insights extremely valuable. I remember participating when I was on the Hill. I've enjoyed it on the client side of things since. How can some of our viewers stay engaged in this research? How can they stay up to date on the work you all are doing at Ballast?
Yeah, the best way to stay involved and updated is to sign up for our Policymaker Hub, which is on our Ballast research website. It's really easy to sign up. Just put in your email and answer a few questions. And then once you do that, you can get access to our archive of research. So other reports that we've created over the years, not just for DC research, but also our state research. And then we also use that to keep folks up to date on events like this, as well as upcoming research. And we'll be launching our quantitative research, DC advocacy research in March of this year. And so we'd invite folks who are interested to participate in that as well.
Great. Well, guys, let's leave it there. We've covered a lot and had a lot of great questions. So I want to thank everyone, especially those in the virtual audience, for taking time out of their busy schedules. Matt, Mike, Michael, I want to thank you guys very much for joining us today and experimenting a little bit. This was our first live video podcast, so I think we did a pretty good job with it. We will share some notes with everybody, and this video will be available on HamiltonPlaceStrategies.com. As Michael just said, to learn more about Ballast findings and stay up to date, you can visit their website, ballastresearch.com. Feel free to subscribe, share, listen on Apple, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. And again, we'll have the video up on our website as well. So from all of us, thank you all for joining, and we'll see you on the next HPS Insights.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insights and follow us on the web at HamiltonPlaceStrategies.com.